At the 48th Phyllis Schlafly Eagle Council, we sat down with Ali Alexander, one of the founders of Culttture, a new media that, quote, chronicles the counterculture movement of free thinkers challenging the status quo. Well, Ali Alexander, really good to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Hey, thank you.
So you are the publisher of Culttture. You know, it's chronicles the counterculture movement of free thinkers challenging the status quo. You know, provocative title. Tell me more about Culttture.
So I think what has happened is we're actually seeing the democratization of the dissemination of information, and that was the promise of the internet, is that consumers and readers would be able to read what they want with whatever perspective they wanted. And you know, the mainstream media did everything they could to stop that. But now here we are, and so there's all these outlets. And what I think is going uncovered is some of the unsung heroes. And a lot of these people are my friends. These are activists who are shaping public policy. And I think what you'll find is that, you know, nonprofits, the left or the right, they'll reframe an activist's work, and then it won't be covered in mainstream media, or worse, it'll be mischaracterized. And so what Culttture seeks to do is clip that content up, because the person working 9 to 5 doesn't have, you know, 2 hours to kill on Periscope, and say, okay, here's what Scott Adams said, here's what Mike Cernovich said, because the White House is watching these people, so we want to watch these people too.
And so you're saying this is right and left?
Yeah, well, it's mostly right, but we cover some disaffected voices on, or it's mostly right, but we cover some disaffected voices on the left too. So I would say it's non-establishment,
okay.
And there's no opinion.
Okay.
So it's about creating raw material, clipping that up, characterizing it, immortalizing it, and you know, making sure that when we look back in a decade or two in what I'm calling the second culture war in America, we know who our heroes are. We can then decide who our villains are too.
That's fascinating. Well, you just have a new follower now.
Thank you.
Because, you know, I'm of course very, very interested in that sort of off the beaten path, but increasingly becoming more important voices.
Right, yeah.
So what is the culture war in your mind?
The culture war in my mind, I think the first culture war was waged between Christianity and, you know, America's roots, and kind of the, you know, the academic left or the institutional left, and I think that the Christians lost. And I count myself as a Christian, but I think the Christians lost. They took prayer out of school. And I think when you lose that original frame, when morality isn't a main constant, and what the Founding Fathers argued, you know, we need an educated populace and a moral populace, in addition to all this other stuff. And I think what we're finding is that we're less educated and we're less moral. And so when we lost that first one, I think that this second one is about education. It's like, what do we know? What do we know? And I've encouraged people at this conference to kind of take a very philosophical look at media. This determines what we know. Before your worldview, before your opinion, before your gut instincts, what the media decides to show you determines what problems you will run up against your worldview, against your views with God, yourself, with your spouse, with your children. What do you want to carry on to the next generation? And so I think that we're kind of having an existential battle. I don't look at this battle as partisan at all, but we're kind of coming to a consensus, and this is what societies do. And my worry is that it's increasingly less civil. I think that the second culture war is about, what do you know? It's that simple. What are you allowed to know? What can you know? What are you allowed to talk about? How are you allowed to frame that? And we're seeing a lot of policing of language go on one side, and the other side is very reactionary. Imagine that. The conservative side is very reactionary, and the left is kind of setting the narrative.
Is it a kind of new morality that's trying to be put in place? I've been wondering about this myself, and with restricting the kind of alternate or different and of course traditional voices. How do you see that?
Yeah, I see it as a new form of authoritarianism. I think it's very dangerous. I think that what the militant atheists think of religion in general, and that is that it is a tool to control the population, and that there's been a lot of use of force, and it's an alternative monarchy, stuff like that. I think that that's actually what's happening with the left. And so I think what you'll see is that they have doctrine, but the doctrine's ever changing, and the language is ever adapting. And if you can imagine, morality says, I must aim higher, I must go here. And so you'll never reach there, but you set your sights there. And this kind of pursuit for perfection, or this pursuit for virtue, is actually a noble thing. And it's not limited to Christianity, it's not even limited to religion. You know, I would say, you know, the samurai or knights, you know, they have kind of a tenet of what they believe, but they were absolutes. So I think the most dangerous thing right now is with progressivism, is that you have an ever elusive virtue or no virtue at all, and you must have compliance to something you can't aim towards. I think that causes chaos and confusion. And, you know, me myself being a Christian, I think that this is kind of prophesized. I said, you know, it's uncanny. It's, you know, it's almost the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. But you could see if we were marching towards Armageddon or the apocalypse, this is kind of the confusion you would need. And it promises that, you know, the book of Revelation does promise kind of a new church, a mirroring of the church and the state. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing when there must be compliance with these pronouns or these terms to recognize these holy principles, and then those change every 4 years. I think it's the most dangerous form of tyranny right now, is this new morality that has no absolute.
And so do you mean by that this morality can be arbitrarily changed, the expectation, but who decides?
Right, no one. No one. So I think.
What do you mean, no one?
I think that people in a collection of people, whether it's communism and there's people participation, or it's some form of republicanism or democracy, there's still some. So I think people try to find consensus. So I think we're all gears grinding against each other.
Okay.
And then I think once we lock, that's when you have a majority consensus. And so what I think is every 4 years we're like, yeah, we want equal treatment for gays. And then half the gears decide to keep moving. Okay, oh, well, now this needs to extend to this, and this, and this. And you're like, well, how did this relate to this? I'm not a bigot, you know? And I think that that's what's happening in society is that, you know, you'll have Christians complain like, well, see, we gave the gays rights, and now there's drag kids. And, you know, there's some truth to that. But that's not where there is consensus on either side. There's not consensus that gays shouldn't be treated equally, but there's not consensus on the drag kids. So it's not somewhere in the middle, but we got to find somewhere where there's a majority. And so what I would say is we're not having a conversation on the difference between ethics and morality. Now ethics is morality, and now it's very religious, and it's also very without absolutes. It's completely dangerous because the human mind does not work this way. For 100,000 years, humans, you know, have not worked this way. So we're experimenting with a dangerous fire, and that's, again, having no absolute, but a moral code to abide by.
You said it's very religious, and I find that interesting. You know, you might not know this, but I was trained as an evolutionary biologist, and one of the things I noticed, and was, you know, very fascinated with the different evolutionary theory, and also particularly non-Darwinian evolution. It was very clear that Darwinian evolution wasn't didn't provide all the answers by a long shot. That's kind of what I was fascinated with. But what I did notice was there was a heck of a lot of people who knew a lot less than I did, who treated, you know, Darwinist evolutionists kind of almost in a religious way. Like if you were to suggest that there's some issue, they would take issue with you. I was like, hey, I study this, you know, what are you talking about, right?
Yeah.
And so is this what you mean by it being very religious? Like this kind of taking on of something that, I don't know, it never occurred to me that evolution could be, you know, religious, have a religious quality to it. But tell me more about this.
Yeah, I think, you know, some people have written about it and they've called it the blue church. And so climate change, evolutionary biology, and specifically it's not climate change, it's climate change, global warming, because as we know, in the 70s and 80s, they were threatening an ice age. And so this is, again, an ever elusive set of tenets that one must agree to before they pursue enlightenment. So you're not allowed to question these foundational questions that aren't foundational at all. You know, science ought to, you know, have the rigor of the scientific method, and I ought to be able to check your work. But they're saying, no, don't go check that. And so that type of commitment to absolutes should be on the right. And so that should be a criticism of liberalism of the right, is like, well, we don't believe that you guys have the family down right, or we don't believe in your definition of God, and you guys have order in a very archaic sense that puts down this minority group or that. Those are valid criticisms of liberalism, of conservatism. But now they've adopted that shell without anything in it. And what they're finding out is they're pouring more things and more things and more things into it. Well, why do you have to keep filling it? You know, you would think that it would eventually fill itself, but it doesn't. So I think what you're finding out is that these people are deeply on the left, this progressive left, non-liberal, illiberal left. They are very, very religious. They are more religious than any religion. And I think that presents a great danger, because it's everything that they warn against.
Let's say you're in your view. Let's say you're in this group. How do you know when you need to change your view? If you're saying that it's ever changing, like from, cold catastrophe to warm catastrophe.
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah. I would say anybody who tells you can't check the work may fear that you're going to check it. And I would say, that was one of the benefits I think that the Reformation brought to Christianity, or even Islam. They have different sects and then different imams, and when a majority of the imams kind of agree, like, okay, that is something that clearly our religion must believe in, and there's plus or minus for every individual. But I think that with the left, if you find yourself being bullied by your friends for asking questions, that's where it starts. And so. My friends don't bully me when I ask questions. They want me to be inquisitive. They want me to ask those edgy questions. Okay. And there are no-go zones on the right as well. And I'm opposed to those. But I think increasingly on the left, you're not allowed to ask the questions. But now, here in the past couple of years, you're not allowed to use words. You're not allowed to construct. What we're finding out is what level can we go deeper than this, and this is what connects you and I. We are communicating.
Right.
This is the Christian concept of Trinity. If God would need to see Himself or crucify Himself to forgive man, this is how He would form consensus, and how humans would form consensus is I exchange an idea with you, and then the viewer gets to decide, I'm opting into that. And when enough viewers decide, we keep moving on as a society, but we're always allowed to check that. So I would say, if you find yourself being bullied for asking questions, that's the first telltale sign. If someone can't show you the original work or you can't reproduce it, it can't be real. We are not beholden to anyone who's dead. And we ought to be able to recreate these things. And I think you find that in religion, whether it's the Jewish faith, the Christian faith, Islam, Buddhism, or whatever, you find that you can recreate the experiences that holy men have said exist. You can't do that with some of these new tenets on the left, and it's ever changing. So
very interesting.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting. Actually, so you did mention that some of what you're seeing kind of, foretells what the Christians believe as the apocalypse. I've thought about this a little bit, because it seems like, let's say around climate change, we've heard that in 12 years, this, this sort of really the most alarmist perspective.
Right.
We're basically, I guess it's past the point of no return towards an apocalypse.
Yeah.
So this apocalypse thing seems to figure heavily, and not just into Christian theology.
Yeah.
And I've been. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's fascinating. I think that when many people are saying the same thing, it must be true, or it must most likely be true. So I find that things have a end and a beginning sounds true, and that it's not limited to a religious perspective, I find fascinating. So Armageddon for Christians, for secularists or scientists, or philosophers, you're talking about a singularity. And so either way, we are approaching a social singularity in our societies. What happens when there are pocket nukes in an open society? What happens when, and we're experiencing this in America with mass shooters, what happens when you have a lot of freedom, a lot of individual freedom, the ability to defend yourself, and you put a bunch of kids on opioids? We're finding out the consequences. So in a lot of ways, we're approaching, I think, a social singularity, that may approach a physical singularity, and we'll be able to see how we coexist as a species with more information, more access to weapons, cheaper, faster, and yeah, I find it absolutely fascinating that, you know.
And just to clarify, you know, when I think of singularity, I'm imagining this sort of, you know, what emerges once AI becomes
Right.
self-aware and basically pulls everything
Right.
into its own consciousness.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about? No, I don't think you're talking about that.
Yeah, so forget quantum physics
Yeah.
and anything that's happening with that singularity, and then forget what everybody's talking about with the singularity with AI. I think prior to that, you know, right now, you know, and I don't want to speak it into existence, but, you know, America has to ask itself, you know, why haven't any of these dirty bombs gone off? And how long before one does go off? And as you know, we become a more scientific species, and that becomes more democratized, and the access to those materials becomes more democratized. You know, how soon, what percentage of the population is always ready to be radicalized? And we have not even begun to have those conversations. We haven't begun to prepare for that. And so, you know, forget AI, forget if the universe is collapsing on itself, you know, those other singularities, but kind of a social singularity will happen first, and I think that will threaten our existence, and how we answer that as a species will happen a lot sooner than self-aware AI that decides that humans need to be obsolete.
Explain the concept to me, because I don't think I'm fully getting what you're saying. I'm not sure our readers. What do you mean by the social singularity exactly?
So I think so you know, there was a famous Prussian military theorist who said, you know, politics is war by other means. And I don't think enough people appreciate this, is that any founding document in any society is simply a contract between neighbors not to use force, or to deter that decision to use force to police or the government or whatever. That is literally all.
To not deal with it yourself.
Yeah, okay. Tribalism.
Sure.
So tribalism, feudalism, and now this is civil society. And so what I'm, and this is a social construct, and I sometimes think that conservatives are silly for bashing the left, for saying, you know, that this is a social construct. Most things that we operate with in society as human creatures, as social creatures, they are social constructs. They can be healthy ones, they can be proven against our biology or our chemistry or whatever, but they are social constructs. And so when I argue that a social singularity is coming, I believe that we will be too social, we will be hyper social, and then that will collapse on itself. We will reach one point in which every society, every social society, every civil society is going to reach this point where
implodes.
Yeah,
basically.
It looks like it. It looks like it. My argument is that something miraculous must happen, and for me, it has to be metaphysical. And I would argue, and I think, you know, a lot of people would argue, is you know, civilization and the idea of democracies and people controlling themselves, you know, remotely, loosely. There's, you know, no such thing as really a democracy, but remotely, kind of changed when a guy named Jesus walked the earth. And so regardless of what you believe about him, that guy did conquer the earth in death. And so his Christian faith took over a Roman Empire. That Roman Empire migrated to the British islands. The British took over the world. America was one of her children. We wrote the words, "We the people," and we abolished kings in this world. And that is the story of Christian people giving a dose to civilization that it needed to tame itself, because it didn't look like, you know, Western civilization and I have great respect for Eastern civilization, but Western civilization wasn't taming itself. And then when kind of, you know, this Christian militarism took over and then cooled itself over time by institutionalizing itself in the Holy Roman Empire, and then the Reformation, and then the Enlightenment kind of cooling itself back down, I think it was the chill pill for civilization. And so I think
fascinating.
Something has to change. Something has to change in our consciousness that applies to billions of people. And I don't know what that's going to be. It might be a document, it might be a video at Epoch Times, but something will change, I hope, or we won't be around.
Wow, that's
Welcome to the culture wars.
I don't get left speechless very often. No, fascinating area of inquiry. Anything you'd like to say to our readers?
I would just say, keep an open mind. I would say that we're about to go through the most monumental. I think we're in a top 3 moment. I mean, I really believe that we're in a top 3 human species moment. The next 50 years are going to determine everything for currency, for what we believe and our societies believe about speech, association, expression, and everything's bound to change. And I don't think that we certainly haven't seen it in our lifetimes. No one alive will have seen so much change as what will happen over the next 50 years. And we literally get to redefine everything, and I think everyone ought to participate, on the left and the right. People who have no political affiliation, we all ought to participate. I think we're all God's children, and so why not?
Ali Alexander, such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.